Once we hit the 1950s, there's a huge wave of revolutions, of independence movements, of new figures and faces rising up in the Arab and Muslim world. And so 50s becomes that defining moment when the Muslim world as a whole begins to take charge. You could say take charge because there are many hidden hands behind the scenes. We begin to see the sons of the soil. In Egypt, we see the Egyptians taking charge. In Pakistan, the same thing. In Malaysia, the same thing. In North Africa, the same thing. And so you begin to see a change of faces. There's a new generation that arises and they take control of the situation. And so this decade is very dynamic and it's very critical for us to understand, because the configuration of the world as we know it today began in the 1950s. Between 1950s and 1959, there was a huge amount of revolutions and revolts in the Muslim world. So we're going to be learning many lessons today actually, insofar as it relates to nation states, different political strategies, and the reality of revolutions. Unfortunately, it's a lesson we have to learn, but there's no better way to learn it than through history. There's virtually almost no leader in that era, no major leader, who wasn't a target of assassination in the 50s. Yeah. Virtually no major leader in the Muslim, especially the Arab world, who wasn't a target of an assassination in the 50s. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately in earnest here, they killed a lot, because the stability a nation requires to flourish in the first 25 years, I'd even say, is actually absolutely essential, because if you don't have 25 years of stability, of building, of establishment, you're not effectively going to grow as a nation the way you should be growing. And these nations are effectively robbed of that opportunity before they can even establish a very basic foundation of civilization. When we begin by assassinations and coup d'etat, what's to follow can't be good. We can't expect anything better to come after that. We set a precedent that will not be improved later on, as we will see. The configuration of the world as we know it today began in the 1950s. It was shortly after World War II. It was also a Reconstruction era for many of the European nations. So for example, Britain, France, America, in its new position as the world-leading superpower. And so while that was happening back home, the ex-colonial nations, colonized nations, begin to actually take sovereignty for themselves and begin to demand more. They don't want to be second fiddle. They want to actually be in the front seat, driving, taking control of the economy, of the resources. And so there's a lot of CIA spy missions happening at that time to topple governments that are too ambitious. There's a lot of double dealing happening. There's a lot of assassination, unfortunately, and a great heap of coup d'etats. So the 1950s is effectively that period in time where it's a cannon, effectively a cannonball. Everything's happening at the same time, but it's very exciting. A lot of lessons to learn, and many precedents are drawn in that period. Pakistan was established in 1947, but within only 4 years we have the first coup d'etat. So as we go through the timeline, you're going to find many coup d'etats. A coup d'etat is effectively when the government, or people who work within the government, most notably the military, decides to topple the government. So it's like an internal sabotage to topple the government from within. So in Rawalpindi, we have the first of these. That happens in 1941. Only 4 years have gone past. Only 4 years. It's not 10 years, it's not 40 years. Just 4 years have gone past, and we have the first instance of a conspiracy to topple the government. This is known as the Rawalpindi conspiracy, and it really is a milestone because it begins, you could say, domino effect, not only in Pakistan but also across other regions of the Muslim world. Yes, we have new governments, we have our new constitutions, we have our new sovereignty, but it's not good enough. And there are people within the military, within the intelligentsia, within the journalistic world who are willing and prepared to go up against their own governments and to topple them. In some cases, CIA is involved, as we're going to see later on. In other cases, it's just inborn conspiracy, and they make efforts to actually overturn their own governments, which is quite honestly a failure because not a decade has gone past yet. and already we have signs of internal fractures. Right? So it's an ominous sign of things to come later on. So that happens in 51. 6 months later, Pakistan's first Prime Minister, 𝗤𝙗𝗓𝗡 Khan, is assassinated. So 6 months following the first coup d'etat, 6 months later he's assassinated, he's killed. So now we have the first assassination of a head of state in the new Muslim world. 4 years only after the establishment of Pakistan. So it's already sending the wrong message. If we don't like our leaders, we just organize a coup, and if we can, we just eliminate the leader. And we're going to find in the 50s many leaders were targeted for these assassinations, many leaders. And if that didn't work, coup d'etat. Right? So we picked up effectively as a Muslim global community a very bad habit of just killing and toppling governments, which we will have to pay for later on. So he's killed in 1951, 6 months later, and he's killed in a place where the future Prime Minister, Benazir Bhutto, is also killed. Okay? So in the same region, the same park, actually it's named after him. In 2007, she's killed. So history repeats itself again and again and again. And this really paves the way, as I said, a trend across the Muslim world, not only in Pakistan, but across the Muslim world, whereby if we don't like our leaders, we eliminate them, either through a coup d'etat or by quite simply killing them.
The wise and friendly voice of 𝗤𝙗𝗓𝗡 Khan, here seen with the Prime Minister, will be missing when next Commonwealth leaders meet in Downing Street. Just 2 years ago, he spoke for Pakistan when they met to plan defense and social welfare. Right-hand man of the late 𝗲𝗓𝗓𝗡 Jinnah, founder of Pakistan, his task was to steer the young state through many dangers. He aligned his country with the great work of the Commonwealth. With Pakistan and India still divided, the bullets of an assassin killed 𝗤𝗓𝗓𝗡 Khan just 40 miles from Kashmir, the last great problem between the two countries. The world has lost a wise counselor.
So we begin within just a few years, not even a decade. Right? We begin by killing and assassinations and coup d'etat. So that's the first instance in Pakistan, and there are many more to come in a decade, by the way. Then we have, in the same year, another assassination in Iran. So Iran at the time, the Prime Minister was Haj Ali Razmara, and he was assassinated also in public. There are many reasons why he was assassinated, but one of the primary reasons was he didn't want for the oil to be nationalized. His argument was we're not ready yet to take control of the operations, because up until then it was the British and the Russians, as we know, and the Americans who were extracting oil and making use of it. And his people wanted him to take control of these and to nationalize it. In other words, take it back for the country. And he was against that. Amongst many other reasons, he was assassinated, again, in broad daylight, in the same year, 51, which in Iran sets off another set of coups and counter-coups. So this is like a curse that begins, a generational curse. So you kill the first Prime Minister, the first President, and it follows on. Others get the same idea. In the next 2 to 3 years, another coup happens, another assassination happens. And so this is actually one of those very significant moments in Iran where we have an assassination of a head of state. When he is removed in 51, he is replaced by Mohammed Mossadegh. Mohammed Mossadegh becomes the next Prime Minister, and he is very keen to nationalize the oil wealth. Very keen. And he quickly kicks out the foreign interests, to the point to which the British take offense to that. And they try to find some way of getting the UN involved and America involved to remove Mossadegh. Okay? So he comes forward and he has a brilliant idea. We should take oil that belongs to the people for the people. Why should France and Britain and the other regions have more right to our oil than us? Let's nationalize it. That makes him a very dangerous man. That makes him a very dangerous man. And so Mossadegh takes control, goes forward with a plan, gets rid of the foreign interests in 51, but he wouldn't last long in power, as you can imagine. First of all, he came through a coup d'etat himself, but secondly, he was pushing a policy that was against the interest of America, of Britain, and of Russia. And so he couldn't have lasted long, but it begins with this effective assassination in 51. We've just began this decade, and we have one after the other, assassination, assassination, assassination. What's happening in the Muslim world? I mean, these nations have only just stood up on their feet, just become independent. And already the first king, the first prime minister, the first president are being assassinated. Abdullah, as we have already mentioned many times, went to make his Jummah prayer in Al-Aqsa. He visited there, and he was shot in the heart.
In Amman, capital of the Jordan, there is mourning in the palace and great sorrow in the hearts of the people. The king who made them a nation is no more. In the great Arab revolt, King Abdallah fought alongside Lawrence. He learned to love Britain, and in these days of trial, he was our friend. For this, he died. To the old city of Jerusalem, King Abdallah went for the Friday prayers. Among his own people, he walked unguarded and unafraid. But there were those who hated him, and as the king entered the mosque to pray, a young fanatic killed the one man who might have brought peace to the Middle East.
So it effectively derails the progress of the nation when you assassinate the leaders very early on. It derails much of the progress. And so Pakistan, Iran, and Jordan, in the same year, imagine living in 1951, and you're reading every 2 or 3 months, another one is gone, another one is gone, another one is gone, right? How does that actually play on the psyche of the Muslim or the Arab population? 2 things can happen. Number one, those who had hopes last year, because these developments only happened last year, right? The new nations and everything else 4 or 5 years ago, may lose hope. It's not going anywhere. Others may have ambition to be the next to topple a government. And that's what happens in many cases. Others see this, coup d'etats work, assassinations work. We're going to adopt the same method to get rid of our leader so we can take position in power. And so the 50s is very chaotic as a result of that. It's like a ping-pong effect. One is down here, another one tries it over there, right? And we have several attempts on the lives of various rulers in the 50s. In 52 again, we have another revolution, right? So the revolutions are just successive. Okay, we have another revolution. Another king is now being removed. In this case, it's King Farouk of Egypt, and he is the final ruling monarch of the Muhammad Ali dynasty. And he's toppled by a group of young officers. You have them here, the very famous 3 officers, but the most influential and the ringleaders, the architects, are Mohammed Naguib, who becomes the first president of Egypt, followed by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who becomes the second president of Egypt, followed by Anwar Sadat, who becomes the third president of Egypt. Okay. They instigate, orchestrate, and execute a revolution in Egypt in 1952, which results in the end of the monarchy. Effectively, I mean, there is another King Fuad comes later. He's a puppet. He's not really. He's a puppet. So they take over in 52, and yet again another nation arises as a sovereign, demands to be sovereign. Egypt has many resources. Egypt is strategically positioned. Egypt has many things going for it, and the new guard, the young Egyptians, who, by the way, was the first time in modern history that Egyptians, native Egyptians, took power. Prior to that, it was only people from outside. Even the Muhammad Ali dynasty, they were outsiders. They were from the Balkans. And the Egyptian soldiers were not allowed to rise above certain ranks in the army for fear of giving them too much power. So this new group of Egyptians from the actual land, the indigenous, take power, and they become the face of Egypt. Naguib becomes president shortly thereafter, but the more ambitious Nasser is pulling the strings and would eventually betray his own friend. We'll see later on. It wouldn't last long before he begins to betray his own friend. But that's another light in the darkness. So now I have another nation, another coup d'etat, another sovereign removed, except for King Farouk is not killed. He's simply exiled away to Italy. But it's a significant, momentous event because Egypt is the most populous Arab nation, and they've managed to pull it off. So the coup d'etat mentality begins to spread like wildfire. You have copycat groups of the free officers that arise in Iraq, that arise in even Saudi Arabia. There's a copycat group of the free officers in Saudi Arabia amongst the princes. We're going to get into that later, inshallah. So they inspire this idea of, we can do the same thing. We're going to have a free officers group as well. We can topple our kings, our monarchy, and become the new leaders of our nations. Okay? And that's exactly what happens in Iraq, in Syria, and in Saudi. The attempts to happen, but it doesn't succeed. But the attempt is made. Meanwhile, in Iran, our friend Mohammad Mossadegh, who was elected 2 years prior, when his predecessor was assassinated, he himself is now removed from power. Only 2 years later. Only 2 years later. So he comes into power through a coup d'etat. 2 years later, he's removed himself from the actual government. He's not killed. But what happens is America, especially Britain, is very concerned with this idea of nationalizing the oil, because they had the British Persian Petroleum Company, Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which they had a huge interest in. It's a huge project, a lot of money coming from it. And if he was to privatize it, they'd be cut off completely. So Churchill especially is very instrumental in lobbying for support. Okay, Churchill was very instrumental in lobbying for support. They went to the UN, they went everywhere. Eventually they decided to do it the old way, the American way, which was to send spies. They sent a spy known by the name of Kermit Roosevelt, who was a grandson of President Roosevelt. They sent him with money, with a few instructions, and he entered Iran and began to sow the seeds of discord. He began to recruit local operatives. Some were within the government, others were local instigators. He financed them, and he helped create the atmosphere that would create a revolution in '53 that would result in the coup that would take Mossadegh out of power.
I was listening to a person, he said, so how he did it was, he was getting, the peasants of society, and they were doing rallies in support of Mossadegh, supporting him. And then after the rallies, they would go and just crush everything, steal and pillage.
Controlled opposition. He actually financed both sides. And initially, it didn't work, so he got new recruits. So from the surface, it looks like there are two separate parties fighting. One is pro-government, one is anti-government. In reality, it was all CIA funded. Both sides were CIA funded. Controlled opposition. Okay? So he managed to do that. And he wrote a book about it, the counter-coup. Because it was known as a counter-coup because Mossadegh himself came through a coup. And this was a counter-coup. Right? So reverse Uno card. And they got rid of him. Unfortunately for Iran, because when Mossadegh was in power, he was actually looking to make them independent of the West, to control their own economy, their own oil resources. But that was not to be allowed for obvious reasons.
One of his rare appearances, Mohammad Mossadegh, Premier of Iran, meets the press to reaffirm his government's unwillingness to arbitrate with Britain over nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. With chances of a settlement fading, the West's best hope is that this sickly man, in whose frail hands may lie the key to peace, is as anti-Russian as he is anti-British.
When he's removed, the Shah returns back from exile. He was in Baghdad. He returns back from exile. He's put in power as a puppet, and they replace what used to be the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company becomes British Petroleum, BP, which effectively is just stealing oil. That's basically it, just stealing the oil of the Iranians. So that happens once they remove him, and he's kept in house arrest until he dies. Okay, so another leader is removed, conveniently so, and the CIA begins to show its hand. If you read the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, he cites this specific agent as being the pioneering agent for the CIA. He was the pioneering agent who actually proved that there are other ways to disturb governments rather than sending armies. It was no longer necessary to send armies to destroy governments. You could send spies. And Kermit Roosevelt is the first and the pioneering example of that, how he got rid of Mossadegh. Quite sad because he didn't really get enough time to even develop his country. 2 years, and he's removed. And the oil wealth that actually belongs to the people is siphoned away, literally stolen. Right? So they go about doing that, and in 1953 another coup d'etat happens. Okay, so the Shah comes back into power. Between 51 to 53, coup after coup after coup, non-stop. You can't even take a break. Coup after coup. We have another coup again in Morocco in 53, and this time against Mohammed Khamis, the very famous king we mentioned earlier on in the series, who refused to send the Jews, who refused to persecute the Jews, who stood up and wanted to actually, although he signed the decree, the Berber decree or the 𝘎𝙗𝙪 decree initially, he was a young man, he actually came back against that and said, no, it's not good to do that, to separate Arabs and Berbers in Algeria, in Morocco. That was the plan of the French, to separate these people so they can better control them. Initially he signed it as a young man. Later on he realized the errors, and he worked towards the liberation of his people. And he would deliver lectures annually, underhandedly encouraging the resistance against the French. Okay, so when they realized that he was becoming a bit uncontrollable, because initially they thought he was actually easy to manage, he's a young man, naive, we can control him, they sent him out, they banished him. They set up a coup against him first and foremost, that's how it always goes, right? They set up a coup against him, his own people turned against him, and then they kicked him out in 53 to the island of Corsica, where Napoleon was kicked out. He was also sent. That's the worst place to send somebody, right? So he goes to the island of Napoleon, then they move him from there to Madagascar. It doesn't last long, because in his absence, the entire population in Morocco more or less unites. Prior to that, you had separate factions. You had the Berbers who wanted to be separate. You had the Arabs who wanted to be separate. You had the nationalists. You had the secularists. They all had their own interests at hand, and they were fighting one another. But when they got rid of the king that they loved, they're all united against the French. So it backfired, and the French had no choice but to return him 2 years later. Okay, but another coup d'etat happens again, effectively in Morocco. So we have a coup d'etat in Pakistan, in Iran, in Morocco, in Egypt, right, within 3 years. And remember, this is the first phase of a new world in a new page in the Muslim history. They've only just become semi-independent or independent. Within 2 or 3 years, the project is already being derailed. Then we have another coup in Pakistan in 53. So only 2 years following the assassination of the first leader, we have another coup. And this time Ayub Khan is behind the plot. Okay, so I want you to imagine, 47, we have a new nation. 51, we've killed our first leader. 53, 2 years later, we have another constitutional coup. We're subverting the government. The pace at which this is happening is too rapid. It's too rapid. And it's giving the wrong message. If you're living in that epoch, in the first 3 years of the 50s, and you have any inclination towards political power, aspiration, and you're witnessing in Jordan, in Pakistan, in Egypt, in Iran, and in Morocco, they're killing and they're replacing, what would you feel your position should be? If let's say you live in, I don't know, you live in Mauritania, more than likely you have the same ambitions as them. Well, they've managed to do it, it's working, so why don't we follow the same trajectory, the same routine, and the same pattern? So it's a self-aggravating problem. The more of these assassinations, these coups d'etats happen, the more those watching from other nations in the Muslim world draw inspiration. And you will see the rate at which these assassinations, attempts, and coups happen only increases in this decade, until we learn our lesson, obviously. So it's really a very dangerous decade to be a politician. Back in Egypt, we have the first coup. So following the initial coup in 52 to get rid of the monarchy, the young officers take position. 2 years later, Abdel Nasser turns against his own colleague and gets rid of him. Right? So he makes him effectively resign. You can see the picture he had taken when he was resigning voluntarily. It wasn't a voluntary resignation, it was a forced resignation. Abdel Nasser had his eyes on the power, on the throne effectively, or in the position of presidency for a long time. And he managed to find pretexts to justify this coup against his own, at this point, president. So only 2 years later, a counter coup happens, and Naguib is removed. He's put in house arrest, and the country now is under a new administration. So Nasser is priming himself to be president. He's not president yet, but he's priming himself. So in the same year in which he removes his predecessor, his colleague, Mohammed Naguib, something shady happens. I'm sure you've all seen this picture, this lecture, where Nasser is giving a public lecture to his audience, and is reassuring them that the dream is alive, and this is the time for us to be independent, and the youth of Egypt, and he's giving them the talk, and suddenly 8 shots ring out. An assassination plot is unfolded, and there is an attempt to kill Nasser.
Mahmoud Abdel Latif is on trial for the attempted murder of Colonel Nasser. He is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, whose Cairo headquarters were burned down by angry mobs. Naguib is said to have been in league with the Brotherhood, who aimed to overthrow Nasser. Other Brotherhood members are held in police custody. This young student, it is claimed, failed to fire at Colonel Nasser when so ordered by the Brotherhood. These men, say Cairo reports, intended to assassinate all Nasser's colleagues and then, together with Naguib, take over the country's leadership. Colonel Nasser stands higher than ever before. His daring stands higher than ever before.
What's known as the Manshia incident is when he gave this lecture, and 8 shots could be heard ringing out. Now, what's interesting about this is for a long time, it was framed as a Muslim Brotherhood, an Ikhwan al-Muslimin conspiracy to kill Nasser. But later on we find out it was actually an inside job. Nasser orchestrated it for himself, but at the same time he wasn't aware that the CIA was also orchestrating it for real.
Welcome to History Yoon, the world's leading online learning platform specializing in Islamic history. To discover the History Yoon mobile app and participate in regular live and interactive seminars and tune in directly from your handset from anywhere in the world. Enjoy instant access to a growing catalog of on-demand streaming content exclusive to the platform, accessible from a variety of devices including desktops, tablets, and cell phones. Connect instantly with our global community of history enthusiasts via our private community forum. To find out more about our online history programs and resources, visit our website today at www.historyyoon.com.